I read two quotes, and one was from Friedrich Nietzsche, and the other was not exactly a quote, but it was a monologue given by Dostoevsky in his book The Idiot. And I have been interrelating the ideas behind these sentences behind these works quite often. And what I have concluded is regarding the relationship of human beings with pain and the relationship with human beings with pleasure and happiness. And the bottom line of my thoughts, what I have found over you know contemplating these things over the past few days, is that pain is something that is closer to us in nature than pleasure. And there are my reasons behind it, which I'll get into in this video. So yeah, just hold on. So I think the first quote I am going to touch is Nietzsche's quote, and he tells us that man loves ultimately his desires and not the thing desired. So keep that in your head while I also read you a short monologue by Dostoevsky in his book The Idiot, which I have right here. So we are going to talk a little bit about this book too. And here Dostoevsky has given a beautiful monologue regarding the attitude of a naive human being towards a certain suffering, and that certain suffering is achieved by way of capital punishment. So this is what he writes. Everyone says the same thing, and the machine is designed, by the way, when he's referring to the machine, he's talking about the guillotine, which was designed to cut people's heads off. And it was a very popular method of execution back in after the Middle Ages and even in the Middle Ages. So yeah, that's a thing to keep in mind. Everyone says the same thing, and the machine is designed with the purpose of avoiding pain. This guillotine, I mean. What if it be a bad plan after all? But here I should imagine the most terrible part of the whole punishment is not the bodily pain at all, but the certain knowledge that in an hour, then in 10 minutes, then in half a minute, then now, this very instant, your soul must quit your body and you will no longer be a man. And this is certain. A murder by sentence is far more dreadful than a murder committed by a criminal. The man who is attacked by robbers in the night, in a dark wood, or anywhere undoubtedly hopes and hopes that he may yet escape until the very last moment of his death. There are plenty of instances of a man running away or imploring for mercy, at all events hoping on in some degree even after his throat was cut. But in the case of an execution, the last hope, having which it is so immeasurably less dreadful to die, is taken away from the wretch and certainty substituted in its place. I can't explain this quote better than it is written. It's a fantastic monologue given by the main character, and this is what has convinced me, at least partly convinced me, that capital punishment is really far more dreadful than an accidental way of dying, or an act of crime committed against you. So now, where do I want to get with these two quotes? In this monologue, Dostoevsky told us that the anticipation of death, the hope lost, subjugated under the certainty of your death, is what causes dread, is what causes suffering inside you. And Nietzsche, in that quote, talks how one is more attached to the desire of obtaining something rather than obtaining the thing itself. So when we interrelate these quotes, I can't help but think that, damn, we really are attached to the idea of getting something, the idea of obtaining something, the idea of being somewhere, the idea of having people to talk about something, rather than those things existing in reality itself. Which brings me to the question which I have written down, is the anticipation of a situation occurring always more gripping than in any actual situation? So, does our willingness to be part of a situation supersede our actual existence in that situation. And by reading these quotes and observing life around us, we can answer that question with a strong yes. So now that brings me to another question. Is the willingness to be part of a reality more compelling and convincing than the reality being real itself? So let's say we didn't know anything was real. Let's say we couldn't distinguish between what was real and what was fake. Would we really would it really impact us in the way we fear it would? Would we really lose all our senses if tomorrow we were told that the life we had been living was all made up? I don't think so. Because we are more attached to the idea of things existing in our lives than those things existing itself. Now, there are very powerful counters to this statement, and people can oppose me all they want. But the statement in itself is not entirely wrong, which makes the idea even more powerful because it is an extreme idea. And that brings me to the point of pain and pleasure. So the hedonists will say that the ultimate purpose of life is to gain pleasure, to maximize pleasure, and to minimize suffering. Well, that's true to an extent, but hedonism is not really an ideal way of living life. Unless some hedonists are watching this, then please quit this video and maximize your pleasure. But yeah, I hate to say it, but you cannot live a life by indulging in consistent hedonism. But those people still valued pleasure and happiness much, much higher than pain and suffering. So why am I still a proponent of pain being closer to humans? That is because the anticipation of pain brings us more pain. So when we anticipate that we are going to feel hurt moments after the present, or some days later, some time later, that gives us more pain. So indulging in thoughts of potential pain induces greater pain. So why is happiness not an inherent part attached to human life? That is because it doesn't work the other way around. If we anticipate happiness constantly, if we try to make things good, if we try to imagine everything is perfect and we try to grip on to that happiness, all it does is bring us more pain and more misery and more sadness and leaves us in those dark trenches. And my only question is, why doesn't it work the other way around? I mean, anticipating pain gives us more pain, so anticipating happiness must give us more happiness, but it doesn't. So there is an anti-correlation between our willingness to be happy and our being happy. Sorry, our time being happy itself. But that isn't in the case of pain, and therefore I think that pain is a much more accurate indicator of human emotions and a much more real part of us, whatever that means, rather than happiness. Because again, there is a subtle difference, not subtle, but yeah, there is a difference between happiness and pleasure, and many philosophers have consistently pointed it out. But for the purposes of this video, I'll consider happiness and pleasure to mean the same thing, at least in a quoted manner. So yeah, that brings me to a point that if anticipation of things happening to us and the anticipation of being in situations or taking part in situations much more valuable to us than being in those actual situations in themselves, then pain must be more valuable to us, because the anticipation of pain brings us more pain, more suffering. This idea does sound terrifying to think about, but it's true. It's technically true. And the anticipation of happiness, well, that means nothing. That again takes you to pain, and so it all circles back to suffering. So yeah, and it's wild to think about, but it's an interesting thought, and I wanted to relate these two monologues